A father's betrayal, a secret affair, and a deadly consequence no one saw coming. This isn't just another true crime story, it's a horrifying tale of deceit, revenge, and murder that shook an entire community. What started as a hidden romance turned into a life-shattering revelation when a young woman discovered she had been infected with HIV. But the real shock? It wasn't her fiancé who gave it to her, it was his own father. And when the truth finally came out, it ended in blood. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more shocking true crime stories, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We would love to tell more shocking stories from your country or region. Now let's get into it. This is not how Marie Foster envisioned meeting her fiancé's father for the first time. The emergency room at St. Mary's was in its usual chaos. For the third shift in a row, she was working non-stop, filling in for a sick colleague. 2 days on her feet were taking their toll. Her eyes were blurry, and her hands shook slightly as she filled out another chart. "Marie, there's a patient with a laceration in cubicle 3, Nancy, the head nurse, called out, holding out a medical card. "Looks like a work-related injury." Marie nodded, fixed a loose strand of hair, and headed in that direction. In the examination room, a stout man in his 50s, with broad shoulders and calloused hands, sat on the couch. His left arm was wrapped in a bloody rag, but his expression remained perfectly calm, as if the deep wound were only a minor scratch. "Mike Richardson," he introduced himself, staring intently at her name tag. "Had a bad experience with the drive shaft. Nothing serious, just a little snag." "Let me decide how serious it is," Marie smiled, putting on sterile gloves and carefully unwrapping the blood-soaked cloth. "Are you a mechanic?" "I own an auto repair shop," he nodded, not even flinching as she began to work the edges of the deep laceration. "On the south end of town, Richardson and Son. Maybe you've seen the sign?" As she examined the wound, she could feel his steady gaze on her. Something in that gaze made her inwardly tense, though outwardly she remained professionally calm. "I'm told you're engaged to my son," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Marie looked up in surprise. "I beg your pardon? James Richardson, tall guy, architect, told me he proposed to a girl in the emergency room, showed her a picture of you. Guess it wasn't such a big world to meet here." "I'm a resident," Marie corrected herself, and then it came to her. "You're James's father. He's told me so much about you. I just didn't think we'd meet under these circumstances." The awkwardness of the situation made her blush. James had indeed mentioned that his father was an auto mechanic and small business owner, but she had pictured him differently, less imposing. "So, that's what you're like?" Mike continued to study her with undisguised interest. "James showed her pictures of you, but they didn't convey all the attractiveness. My son has always been good at choosing." Marie concentrated on treating the wound, trying to keep her tone professional. For some reason, his compliment seemed a little out of place, but she chalked it up to overwork. "It's a deep wound, Mr. Richardson. It's gonna need at least 10 stitches. I'll administer the anesthesia now. Call me Mike," he smiled as he watched her draw the anesthetic into the syringe. "Since we'll be family soon. I don't like formalities with loved ones." Their wedding to James had been set for early fall, and by summer, when her apartment was undergoing a long-awaited renovation, James had offered to move in with him temporarily. It made sense. They were planning to live together after the wedding anyway, and the extra 3 months under the same roof would only strengthen their relationship. "Dad won't mind," James assured her, hugging her. "The house is big enough for everyone to have their own space. You don't have to overlap all the time." The day they moved in, Mike met them on the doorstep and was emphatically friendly and welcoming. "Welcome to our home, Marie." He helped her with her suitcase, picking it up easily with his strong arms. "I hope you like it here. Has James shown you your room yet?" The Richardson house was a spacious 2-story mansion in a quiet suburb. A neatly trimmed lawn, a 2-car garage, a well-kept backyard with a barbecue, and a small pool. Typical middle-class American prosperity achieved through years of hard work. "Mom picked it out," James explained, noticing her admiring gaze as they climbed the wide staircase to the second floor. "She had great taste. We hadn't changed much since she died." Mrs. Richardson had died of cancer 5 years ago, and since then, father and son had lived together, keeping the house in perfect order, as if preserving the memory of the woman who had once filled it with life. Marie was placed in James' spacious room on the second floor, with large windows and a view of the manicured garden. Mike's bedroom was in the opposite wing of the house, giving everyone the privacy they needed. A polite but reserved relationship had developed between her and her future father-in-law, which suited them both just fine. It was especially noticeable when James was away on business, which had been happening more and more often lately. "Travel is part of my profession," he explained apologetically, packing another suitcase. "This project in Philadelphia is very important for my career, but it won't take long, I promise. After the wedding, I plan to reduce travel." On nights like this, she'd have dinner alone with Mike. He asked about her work, told funny stories about the clients of his workshop, recalled what James was as a child. It was all quite ordinary and even sweet, as it should be in the relationship of future relatives. Insomnia had haunted Marie since she was a teenager. During stressful periods of life, it returned with renewed vigor, depriving her of proper rest. Moving to a new home, wedding preparations, and a busy hospital schedule all exacerbated the problem to the point where dark circles under her eyes became her constant companions. "You look like a ghost," James said one morning, kissing her gently on the forehead before he left. "Maybe you should see a specialist." "You can't do that. You're a doctor, you know that." She resisted the idea for a long time, trying to cope with folk remedies. Warm milk with honey, soothing herbal teas, meditation before bed. But nothing worked. Finally, she gave up and made an appointment with a neurologist. He listened carefully, conducted the necessary tests, and prescribed a mild sleeping pill. "Start with half a tablet before bedtime," the doctor advised, writing the prescription. "If the effect is not enough, you can increase it to a whole one, but do not exceed the dosage and do not take longer than 3 weeks without consultation." The medicine worked from the first night. For the first time in a long time, Marie slept without waking, falling into a deep, restorative sleep. But soon she noticed a strange side effect. Sometimes in the morning she felt unusually wrecked, as if she hadn't rested at all despite a full 8 hours of sleep. And then there was this inexplicable sense of unease, as if something had happened to her during the night that she couldn't remember. By early July, Marie began to notice a disturbing change in her well-being. At first it was just increased fatigue, which she attributed to adjusting to sleeping pills and an intense work schedule. Then night sweats, a slight rise in temperature in the evenings, and general weakness were added. "Probably got the summer flu," shrugged Michelle, her colleague in the infectious disease department, when Marie shared her symptoms with her during her lunch break. "No wonder you work in a hotbed of infections. Everyone's waffling with it these days. Heat, air conditioning, weakened immune system." Marie nodded, agreeing with the logical explanation, but the inner voice kept insistently whispering that something was wrong. A week later, enlarged lymph nodes appeared on her neck and in her armpits, followed by an unexplained rash on her chest and back. As a physician, Marie realized that it no longer looked like a common viral infection or stress reaction. Everyone on the ward knew about her upcoming wedding, so no one was surprised when she asked for an extended blood test, including tests for infections, including HIV. It was a common practice before marriage, just a formality, a routine medical precaution. "You can come back for the results on Monday," the lab technician said, picking up the vial of blood. "Or should I email them to you?" "I'd rather come in myself," Marie replied, pulling up the sleeve of her robe. She didn't feel any anxiety. This was just a medical protocol that she and James had already gone through at the beginning of their relationship, a pure formality. Monday came unexpectedly quickly. Marie was just finishing a patient's discharge paperwork when a nurse called out to her. "Dr. Morris is looking for you. He says it's urgent." The elderly lab manager, who had once been her professor in medical school, looked unaccustomedly serious as she entered his office. "Close the door, Marie," he said, indicating the chair across from his desk. "I need to talk to you." Marie's heart skipped a beat. That's no way to be summoned to a conversation with good news. "Is there something wrong with my labs?" she asked, trying to remain calm. Dr. Morris nodded, opening the results folder in front of her. "I'm afraid so. Your HIV test is positive, Marie." The room tilted. Marie gripped the armrests of the chair tightly to keep from falling. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, her mouth drying. "There must be a mistake in the analysis." "We've already double-checked it," Morris said softly, looking at her sympathetically. "Both the antibody test and the PCR, the result is unequivocally positive. But She paused, unable to find the words. "That's just not possible, Doctor." Morris, he'd known Marie for 6 years, first as a student, then as an intern, now as a colleague. She'd always been a sensible, responsible young woman. "Have you had any unprotected intercourse in the last 6 months?" he asked without judgment in his voice, purely professional. "Only with James." She shook her head, still not believing what she was hearing. "And we were both tested before we started the relationship. He was clean. I was clean. We're faithful to each other. I'm pretty sure of that." Morris nodded, thumbing through the papers. "I believe you, Marie, but the facts are these. The infection is present in your system, and it appears that the infection is relatively recent, about 2 to 3 months ago. This is evidenced by the antibody ratio and the presence of an acute phase." Marie froze. 2 to 3 months ago. It coincided with her moving into the Richardson house. "You have to tell your partner," Morris continued, breaking the long silence. "By law, he has a right to know and must be tested. You also need to make a list of everyone you've had close contact with." She nodded, unable to utter a word. "Marie," Dr. Morris stepped forward. "I know it seems like the end of the world right now, but I have to tell you, as a doctor, modern therapy can control the disease. You'll live a long, full life if you start treatment now. It's no longer a death sentence as it was 20 years ago." Marie listened to his words, but it was as if they were passing through a fog. Suddenly, like a flash, a thought flashed through her mind, and she tried to push it away. "Mike," she whispered almost inaudibly. "What?" Dr. Morris interjected. "Nothing." Marie stood up abruptly. "Thank you for the information, Doctor." Morris. "Yep. I need some time to think about it." She spent the rest of the day in a fog, mechanically performing her duties. Her thoughts kept returning to the diagnosis and the impossibility of what had happened. James couldn't have infected her. She was as sure of that as the sunrise. Someone else then? But who? She hadn't had any other partners in the last 6 months. There had been no accidental injections at work, no blood transfusions or other medical procedures. She'd been sitting in the kitchen that evening, mindlessly flipping through a medical reference book when the front door slammed and Mike walked into the house. He smelled of motor oil and whiskey. Apparently, he'd stopped by the bar after work. "Bad day?" he asked, noticing her pale face and sleep-deprived eyes. "A little tired." Marie tried to smile, but her lips wouldn't do it. Mike opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of beer, and deftly opened it against the edge of the countertop. "James called today, said he'd be delayed another 3 days. Some problem with the project needing to redo the blueprints." Marie cringed. 3 more days in this house alone with that man. "Where were you this afternoon?" she asked suddenly to herself. "I went into the workshop to talk to you." It was an impulsive question, almost an accusation. Mike turned slowly toward her, his gaze sharp for a second. "Went to a parts supplier in a neighboring town," he answered after a short pause. "Why? Did something happen?" "Nothing, just..." She shook her head, averting her gaze. "It doesn't matter, You seem strange today." Mike moved closer, looking at her carefully. "Are you sure everything's okay?" "Yes, of course," Marie answered too quickly, getting up from the table. "I'm just tired. I think I should go to my room. Is there anything I can do to help?" He took another step toward her. Marie suddenly felt her heart beat faster. Something about his demeanor, the way he was looking at her, was vaguely unsettling. Or was it just her imagination spurred on by the shocking diagnosis? "No, thank you." She retreated to the door. "I'm going to take a sleeping pill and go to bed. Good night, Mike." As she climbed the stairs, she could feel his eyes on her, and for the first time since the move, she was glad that the door to her and James's room was locked. In her room, Marie carefully locked the door and leaned against it, trying to gather her thoughts. The diagnosis didn't fit in her head, but the results were unequivocal. And as a doctor, she couldn't ignore them. Something had happened, something she didn't understand or remember. She pulled out her phone, dialed James's number. The long beeps came one after another, but he didn't answer. "The person you are calling is temporarily unavailable. Please leave a message after the tone." "James, it's me." Her voice shook as she spoke into the receiver. "Call me as soon as you can. It's important. It's very important. Please?" Putting the phone down, she walked to the window. There was a light on in the next wing of the house, Mike's room. She could see his silhouette moving behind the translucent curtain, like a blurred shadow. "I need proof," Marie thought, turning away from the window. She opened her laptop, connected to her home Wi-Fi, and typed into a search engine, "hidden camera by." The search results showed a plethora of options, from professional equipment to simple household gadgets. "Same-day delivery," read an advertisement for one of the online electronic stores. Marie took a deep breath and clicked order, selecting a miniature camera that could be hidden almost anywhere. "Tomorrow I'll know the truth," she thought as she closed her laptop, as scary as it may be. The camera was delivered the next day. The unassuming box Marie received on her lunch break looked perfectly ordinary. No one would have guessed its contents. The device was tiny, little more than the size of a button, with a lens that was almost indistinguishable to the eye. All the way home, she pondered where best to mount the camera. The bedroom was spacious, with a large double bed, bookshelves, and an antique dresser. It needed a place with a good view, but inconspicuous enough not to attract attention. At home, the first thing she did was check to make sure the door was locked, then took the camera out of its packaging. According to the instructions, the device could run for up to 12 hours on a single charge and would activate when motion was detected, saving battery life and memory. After brief deliberation, Marie chose the bookshelf opposite the bed. Among the many volumes on medicine and fiction, the tiny camera was virtually invisible. She set it between two books, pointing the lens at the bed, then stepped back to check the view. Perfect. The device covered the entire bedroom, including the door and most of the bed. Activating the recording, she made sure everything worked and stashed the remote in her purse. Now, all that was left to do was wait. The next few days passed in agonizing anticipation as Marie continued to take sleeping pills, partly because of her real sleep problems, exacerbated by the shocking diagnosis, partly because of the need to recreate familiar conditions. Each morning, she checked the tape, but found nothing suspicious. James had finally returned from a business trip, and his presence calmed her anxieties a little. That night, Marie slept truly peacefully for the first time in many days, without the sense of strange anxiety that had been haunting her lately. "You never said what you wanted to discuss," James reminded her the next morning, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Your message made it sound important." Marie froze with the cup in her hands. She wasn't ready to tell him about the diagnosis yet. Not now, not before she knew exactly what had happened. "It can wait," she finally answered. "I was just bored and worried. How was the business trip?" James began to talk about the problems with the project, the difficult clients, and the endless negotiations. But Marie listened half-heartedly. Her thoughts were occupied with the night ahead. James was leaving again, this time for only one night to meet with the contractors. "I don't want to leave you alone," he said, packing his briefcase. "You've been a little pale lately. Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, I'm just tired. Work, you know?" Marie tried to sound casual. "Go on, I'll be fine." After seeing him off, she went back to the bedroom and checked the camera. The battery was charged, the memory was empty, everything was ready to record. She'd spent the entire evening on pins and needles, barely touching the dinner Mike had prepared for them. "You've hardly eaten anything," he remarked, watching her closely. "James is worried about you, and so am I." "I'm just not very hungry," Marie faked a smile. "No need to worry." Mike nodded, but his gaze remained attentive. "How have you been sleeping lately?" "James said you were having trouble with insomnia." Marie felt a chill run down her spine. "It's better," she said carefully. "The doctor prescribed sleeping pills and they're working." "That's good." He smiled, and there was something in his smile that made her want to leave the room immediately. A good night's sleep was very important. After dinner, Marie went up to her room, citing fatigue. Locking the door, she checked the camera again. making sure it was properly set up and activated. Then she took her sleeping pills as usual, leaving a glass of water on the bedside table, and went to bed trying to calm her racing heart. She woke up late, feeling a familiar heaviness in her whole body, and a strange feeling as if something had happened during the night. The clock read almost noon. She had slept longer than usual. Rising from the bed with difficulty, Marie went first to the bookshelf. The camera was in place, the LED indicating that it was recording. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the memory card and inserted it into her laptop. Opening the file, she clicked play. The first few hours of video showed only a dark, quiet room with her lying motionless in bed. Nothing out of the ordinary. Marie began scrolling the tape forward, watching the minutes on the timer change at an accelerated rate. 2 hours and 43 minutes. The doorknob slowly turned. Marie inhaled convulsively, stopping the scrolling and returning to normal speed. On the screen, her bedroom door opened smoothly and Mike entered the room. He was wearing house pants and a t-shirt, moving silently like a cat. Closing the door behind him, he stopped, listening. Marie was still on the bed. The sleeping pills had worked perfectly. Making sure she was sound asleep, Mike approached the bed. His face, illuminated by the faint moonlight from the window, expressed a strange mixture of lust and concentration. He reached out and gently pulled back the blanket. Marie stared at the screen wide-eyed, unable to believe what she was seeing. The footage showed her lying in a light nightgown, completely relaxed and defenseless. Mike crouched on the edge of the bed, and for a few moments just stared at her. Then his hand slowly reached up and touched her face, slid down her neck, slid lower. Marie abruptly pressed pause, feeling nausea coming up to her throat. She had to take several deep breaths to calm herself. What she saw was unambiguous, unequivocal. Mike, her fiancé's father, was sneaking into her bedroom while she slept, and she forced herself to continue watching, though every second was agonizing. The tape mercilessly captured Mike pulling the blanket off her completely, his hands sliding down her body, tugging up her nightgown. Then he stood up, quickly removed his clothes, and lay down beside her. The nausea came with renewed vigor, and Marie barely made it to the bathroom in time. She threw up. With shaky hands, she washed her face with cold water, avoiding looking at her reflection in the mirror. Then she stood for a few minutes, leaning her forehead against the cool tile, trying to cope with the hurricane of emotions. Returning to her laptop, she forced herself to watch the tape to the end. There was no doubt about it. Mike Richardson had abused her while she was helpless under the influence of sleeping pills. And by the looks of it, it wasn't the first time he'd done it. The tape showed him carefully adjusting her clothes, covering her with a blanket as if nothing had happened, and then silently leaving the room, closing the door behind him. Marie closed the file, unable to watch any longer. Everything was crystal clear now. The diagnosis, the strange feeling in the morning, and the inexplicable sensation that something was happening to her at night. Mike obviously knew about her HIV status and was deliberately putting her at risk by not using protection. As a doctor, she understood that infection during a single unprotected exposure was not 100%, but the likelihood increased with repeated episodes. And judging from her condition and the way Mike had acted confidently on the tape, there had been several such episodes. Her first impulse was to call the police immediately. Her hands were already reaching for the phone when she stopped. She had the evidence, but what next? Investigation, public trial, depositions, gossip. James. What would happen to James when he found out? His father, the man he loved and respected, had turned out to be a monster. She saved the recording to a flash drive, then another for safekeeping. After some thought, she decided to upload the file to password-protected cloud storage so the evidence would be preserved no matter what happened. The sound of the front door opening made her flinch. James had returned earlier than expected. She heard him coming up the stairs and quickly closed the laptop. "Marie?" His voice sounded concerned. "Are you home?" "Yes, I'm here," she replied, trying to sound normal. When he walked into the room, smiling his usual warm smile, she almost didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. Almost. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Sit down, please." The smile faded from his face, replaced by concern. "Is something wrong?" "Yes." She took a deep breath. It's hard for me to even begin. But James, I've been diagnosed HIV positive. He froze, unmoving, as if he didn't understand what she'd said. What? But how? That's impossible. That's what I thought too. Marie opened her laptop. Until I found out the truth. Her voice shook as she told him about her suspicions, about the camera she'd installed. James listened, growing paler with each word. I need you to watch this, she said, opening the video file. But I have to warn you, it's horrible. She turned on the tape from the moment the door opened and Mike walked into the room. Unable to watch again, Marie turned away to the window, but she could hear the sounds from the screen and James's heavy breathing. When the tape ended, there was dead silence in the room. Marie slowly turned around. James sat motionless, his face white as chalk, his eyes wide open, terror frozen in them. James? She called out cautiously. He didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear her. Then his hands began to tremble, his face contorted in a grimace of rage and pain. It was an expression Marie had never seen on his usually calm, smiling face. I'm going to kill him, James whispered faintly. James, wait. But he was already on his feet, clenching his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Where is he? He should be in the workshop. But listen. James turned to her, and Marie stepped back. The fury in his eyes was so fierce that for a moment she was afraid. I'm calling the police, she said, trying to get through to him. We have proof. He'll go to trial. He'll be punished. Trial? James shook his head. What the hell kind of trial after what he'd done? Focused. I'm sorry. You're right, he said in a suddenly calm tone. I need to think. Marie watched him anxiously as he walked over to the window, looking out into the distance. His shoulders were tense, but his voice sounded almost casual when he spoke again. Does he know I'm back? I don't think so. I haven't been down all day. James nodded, still looking out the window. Good. I need to, check on something in the garage. You call the police. James, what are you up to? Marie asked with growing concern. He turned to her, and she saw that his eyes were strangely empty, as if something had gone out in them. Nothing. I just want to check my tools. Call the police, Marie. He came over and gently touched her face, kissed her forehead. I love you. Whatever happens, remember that. Before she could respond, James left the room. Marie heard his footsteps on the stairs. Then the front door slammed. She ran to the window and watched him cross the yard and enter the garage. Nothing happened for a few minutes, then James stepped out and walked confidently toward his car. Without looking back, he got behind the wheel and drove away. Marie was left standing at the window, not knowing what to do. Call the police? But what to say? My fiancé drove off with a kind of weird look on his face after he found out his father raped me. They'd only laugh. She sank down on the bed, feeling utterly devastated. The events of the last few days seemed to have drained her of all her strength. Diagnosis, the recording, the conversation with James. It was all too much for one person. The phone rang, making her flinch. James' name popped up on the screen. Yes, she answered hurriedly. Marie. His voice sounded oddly calm. I'm going to the workshop. Don't call the police yet, okay? I want to talk to him first. Find out why. James, I don't think that's a good idea, she objected. In your condition, I'm perfectly fine, he interrupted. Just trust me, okay? I'll call you later. The connection went dead. Marie stared at the phone, unsure of what to do. Something in James's voice disturbed her, that unnatural collectedness after the initial explosion of rage. It was as if he'd made some kind of decision and was now methodically carrying it out. She dialed his number, but the phone was already disconnected. Anxiety was growing by the minute. Suddenly, Marie remembered his strange words. I love you. Whatever happens, remember that. It was like a goodbye. Grabbing her car keys out of her bag, she ran out of the house. Whatever James was up to, she had to stop him before it was too late. Mike's workshop was 15 minutes away. All the way there, Marie prayed she'd make it on time. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, her heart pounding like crazy. When she pulled into the driveway of the workshop, she saw James's car parked out front. Mike's old pickup truck was parked next to it, so they were both inside. Marie jumped out of the car and rushed to the workshop doors. They were unlocked. It was semi-dark inside, with only a light burning in the far corner. "James!" she called out. "Mike?" No one answered. She walked toward the light, passing cars and workbenches with tools on elevators. A black sedan with its hood open was parked against the far wall. Someone's legs and oil-stained jeans were visible under the car. "Mike!" Marie called out, coming closer. The man under the car didn't move. She noticed that the car was on a simple mechanical jack, not on a hoist like the other cars in the shop, and something was wrong with that jack. It wasn't set up right, as if... Suddenly, she saw a dark puddle spreading out from under the car. Terror gripped her as she realized it wasn't car oil. "Mike!" Marie shouted, rushing toward the car, but it was too late. The jack had been lowered and the heavy sedan had crushed the man lying beneath it. Judging by the unnatural position of the body and the spreading blood, the car had collapsed right on top of his head and chest. Marie recoiled, clamping her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. At that moment, footsteps were heard behind her. "I told you not to come!" James' voice was quiet, almost detached. She turned around slowly. He was standing a few feet away, his hands gloved, and a strange blank expression on his face. "James, what have you done?" she whispered. "An accident," he replied, not averting his gaze. "The jack slipped. It happens. But you..." "I came and found it like this," James continued in the same calm tone. "I must have set the jack wrong. A tragic accident." Marie stared at him, unable to believe her ears. "James, this is murder. We have to call the police." "I already did." He pointed to his cell phone. "They're on their way. I'll explain everything. And you saw nothing but the result of an accident. Do you understand?" His eyes, usually so warm and loving, now looked at her with cold determination. Marie felt a chill run down her spine. But the tape? The evidence? Forget about the tape. James's voice was steely. It never existed. You don't know why you have HIV. Probably an accidental injection at work. Happens to medics. You just came here to inform your father of your diagnosis, and you found him. Just like that. You're asking me to lie to the police? Marie couldn't believe what was happening. "I'm asking you to protect both of us," James replied, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. "Marie, think about it. What would happen if the truth came out? A lawsuit, publicity, your name in all the papers. Bride contracted HIV from groom's father. Can you imagine the headlines? And then I'd be convicted of murder and you'd be alone." His voice softened, almost pleading. "I did it for you. For us. He deserved his punishment. But that doesn't mean we have to suffer for the rest of our lives." A siren wailed in the distance. James gripped her hands tighter. "Just tell me you came here and found him dead. You don't know anything else. I'll take care of the rest." Marie stared at the man in front of her, suddenly realizing she didn't know him at all. Or maybe it was the other way around. Just now, she was seeing the real him, capable of such drastic actions for her. The sirens were getting closer. There was no time to think. "All right," she said at last. "I'll say I don't know anything." James exhaled with visible relief. "Thank you," he whispered, pulling her to him. "I love you. We'll get through this together. I promise." The flashing lights of police cars showed outside the workshop windows. Marie took a deep breath, preparing for her role as the bride who accidentally discovered the body of her fiancé's father. An accident. Just a tragic accident. But deep inside, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Detective Sarah Montgomery arrived on the scene 15 minutes after the first patrol crew. Her dark blue Ford was parked next to police cars and an ambulance whose flashers colored the front of Richardson & Sons Auto Repair Shop with red and blue flashes. Sarah was a short woman with short cropped brown hair and a tenacious look in her brown eyes. She'd seen a lot in her 12 years in homicide, but each new case still brought out that special professional curiosity that made her one of the best detectives in the department. "What do we got?" she asked, showing her ID to the officer at the door. "An accident, it looks like," the young patrolman replied. "A man approximately 50 years old was working under a car. The jack failed and the car collapsed. Medics say death was instantaneous, Multiple skull fractures, crushed chest. Who found the body? The son and his fiancée. The patrolman nodded towards the ambulance, where a young couple was sitting on the folding step. They said they came to visit their father and found him already dead. Sarah nodded and headed inside the workshop. The forensics team was working against the far wall, where the black sedan was parked. The body had already been covered, but the pool of blood on the concrete floor spoke more eloquently than any words could say about the nature of the injuries. Detective Montgomery, she introduced herself to the forensics team leader, a gray-haired man with glasses. Dr. Levine, he nodded. A routine accident at first glance. The victim was working under the car using a mechanical jack. Apparently the jack slipped or broke. The car collapsed on top of the man. At first glance, Sarah interjected, catching the note of doubt in his voice. Levine adjusted his glasses. There's just something about the position of the body that doesn't add up. If he was on his back and working on the engine or transmission, the damage would have been in the chest area. But the brunt of the impact was to the head. It's like he turned around or, well, that's an odd posture for a mechanic. Sarah squatted down to get a better look at the scene. What about the jack? Here it is. Levine pointed to the crumpled structure. Severely deformed under the weight of the car, probably defective or improperly installed. The detective scrutinized the room, noting every detail. The tools on the workbench, the half-disassembled engine in the corner, the oil stains on the floor. Many of the details seemed ordinary for a machine shop, but something still bothered her professional instincts. Who owns the shop? She asked. Mike Richardson, our victim, Levine replied. Family business, according to the sign. Sarah took another look around the room and headed for the exit. She needed to talk to the people who had found the body. The young couple was still sitting by the ambulance. The guy, tall and statuesque, had his arm around the girl, pulling her close to him as if protecting her from the outside world. As Sarah approached, he raised his head, and she saw in his eyes a strange mixture of shock and some other feelings she couldn't immediately identify. James Richardson, she asked. Yes, he nodded. Are you a detective? Sarah Montgomery, homicide, she introduced herself, showing her ID. I'm sorry for your loss. I need to ask you a few questions. James tensed slightly but nodded. Of course. This is my fiancée, Marie Foster. The girl looked pale and shocked, but in her gaze, Sarah saw not only horror at what she saw, but also some determination. Tell me how you found the body, the detective asked, pulling out a notebook. We came to visit my father, James began. His voice was steady, but the fingers clutching Marie's hand were visibly white. The workshop door was open. We went in and, we saw him there under the car. You knew he was dead right away, didn't you? James nodded. Yes, it was obvious. And why did you decide to visit your father today? Sarah watched both of them carefully for their reactions. We wanted to discuss the details of the wedding, Marie replied, her voice trembling slightly. James and I are getting married in 2 months. And you both drove separately? The detective noticed 2 cars on the other side of the parking lot. Not together? Yeah, I was on a business trip, James explained. I got back early and drove straight here. Marie arrived a few minutes after I did. Sarah made a note in her notebook. Did your father work alone? No helpers? No other mechanics? There was one, Mike, but he quit a month ago, James answered. My dad was going to hire a new one, but for now he was doing fine on his own. The detective continued to question them about Mike's daily routine, his habits, his health, his family relationships. The answers were logical and consistent, but something in the couple's behavior made her feel they weren't telling the whole truth. Ms. Foster, do you work alongside Mr. Richardson? Sarah asked, changing the direction of the conversation. I'm a resident at St. Mary's Hospital, Marie replied. A doctor? Sarah raised an eyebrow slightly. So you have a medical degree? Yes, I'm finishing my residency in general internal medicine. And when you arrived, you didn't try to help? The detective's voice sounded slightly incredulous. Marie shook her head. It was obvious he was dead. The injuries were incompatible with life. Sarah nodded, making another note. Then she looked at James. Your father was an experienced mechanic, right? 25 years in the trade, he confirmed. Opened this shop when I was 5 years old. And he could make such a grave mistake when installing a jack, especially working alone? James tensed. What do you mean? It's just strange that such an experienced mechanic didn't use the hoist that was installed in the workshop, but opted for a simple jack, Sarah explained. And the posture in which he was found? It's unusual for someone working under a car. Dad often ignored safety rules, James said firmly. I told him that many times. Mr. Richardson, where were you last night and this morning before you came here? Yesterday I was in Philadelphia on a job, an architectural project. Got back this morning about 11 o'clock, went home, then here. And you, Miss Foster? I was at home. Marie's voice was firm. I was resting after the night shift. Sarah made a few more notes, then closed the notebook. Thank you for the information. We'll be in touch if we have any further questions. You should probably go home and get some rest. Was it really an accident? James asked, getting up. Or do you suspect something else? The detective looked at him carefully. At the moment, we're treating it as an accident, Mr. Richardson, but we're obliged to check all leads. As the couple left, Sarah returned to the workshop where the forensics team were finishing their work. Anything interesting? She asked Dr. Levine. Nothing unusual, he replied. All the injuries are consistent with a heavy vehicle crash. Time of death is about 3 or 4 hours ago. What about the jack? It's an older model that's seen a lot of use. Could have been an original defect, metal fatigue, but the lab can tell us for sure. Sarah nodded and walked slowly around the room, examining every corner. A bottle of whiskey and a couple of glasses were in the far locker. On the desk was a stack of bills and some medical papers. She picked up the top sheet and frowned as she read the diagnosis. HIV positive. Levine, she called out. Take a look at this. The forensic scientist walked over, looked at the paper. Test results. From the looks of it, the victim was HIV positive. And for a long time, judging by the readings, Sarah tapped her finger thoughtfully on the document. I wondered if the son knew about it. Taking the papers as evidence, she took another look at the scene and walked outside. Something told her that this case was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. Sarah spent the next few days gathering information on the Richardson family. She learned that Mike had been widowed 5 years ago when his wife died of cancer. Since then, he had lived alone with his son in a spacious house in the suburbs until Marie, James's fiancée, had recently moved in. According to acquaintances and neighbors, relations in the family were normal with no apparent conflict. The medical examiner's office confirmed that the death was due to injuries sustained in the car crash, and the victim's blood contained traces of alcohol sufficient to affect coordination. That explained the possible error in jacking the car, and yet something kept Sarah from closing the case. Her intuition, honed over years of investigating, told her there was something more lurking here. On Thursday, 3 days after the incident, she arrived at the Richardson house again. James opened the door, looking tired but collected. Detective Montgomery? There was surprise in his voice. Is something wrong? Just wanted to go over a few details, Sarah replied. May I come in? He stepped back reluctantly, letting her into the house. Of course. Marie's at work right now. In the living room, Sarah noticed the pictures on the walls. Family portraits, snapshots of a young couple, a smiling woman, must be the late Mrs. Richardson. Getting ready for the funeral? The detective asked, taking a seat in the chair. Yes, tomorrow. James remained standing. A modest ceremony, just close friends. Sarah nodded. Mr. Richardson, what did you know about your father's medical condition? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? We found medical records in the workshop. Your father was HIV positive. Did you know that? James froze, his face visibly pale. Number I didn't know. When did this happen? According to the test results, the infection wasn't new, at least a few years. Sarah watched his reaction carefully. Does that surprise you? Of course. He rubbed his face with his hand. My father never told me about it. I thought I knew everything about him. And your fiancée? The detective suddenly asked. She's a doctor. Could she have seen the symptoms? Marie only moved in 3 months ago. James shook his head. And her father hadn't been open with her. Sarah caught something odd in his tone, as if there was a different meaning behind the words. "Mr. Richardson?" She stepped forward. "If you know anything about what happened in the workshop, now would be a good time to tell me." James held her gaze. "I've already told you everything I know. It was an accident." "Are you sure?" Sarah didn't take her eyes off him. "Because some of the details don't add up, like the position of the body, or the fact that an experienced mechanic used a faulty jack when the shop had a hydraulic elevator." "Dad often neglected safety," James repeated. "I warned him many times." "One more thing," Sarah continued, ignoring his explanation. "The forensics showed that the main impact was to the head and upper chest, as if your father hadn't just been lying on his back under the car, but had been crushed suddenly when he tried to get out." James didn't answer, only clenched his fist so hard his knuckles turned white. "Or as if someone had deliberately lowered the jack," Sarah finished. "That's a serious accusation, Detective." James' voice sounded cold. "Do you have any proof?" "Not yet," she admitted honestly, "but I keep looking." At that moment, the front door opened and Marie entered the house. When she saw the detective, she froze on the threshold of the living room. "Detective Montgomery?" Her voice sounded surprised but calm. "Is something wrong?" "Just confirming a few details about the incident," Sarah replied. "In fact, you might just be able to help. As a medical professional, have you noticed any symptoms in Mike Richardson that indicate a health problem?" Marie glanced at James, then shook her head. He seemed perfectly healthy. "Why?" "We found out he was HIV positive," Sarah reported. "Probably has been for a few years now." Marie's face didn't change. Only her eyes widened slightly. I didn't know. He never talked about it." "Ms. Foster," Sarah looked directly at her, "if you know anything about Mike Richardson's death that can help the investigation, now is the time to tell me." "I've already told you everything I know," Marie replied firmly. "James and I arrived at the workshop and found him dead. It was an accident." Her gaze was open and confident, but Sarah noticed James gently take her hand, as if offering support. "All right," the detective rose. "Thank you for your cooperation. We'll be in touch if we have any further questions." As she was leaving, she noticed a laptop on the table by the entrance with a flash drive sticking out of it. Something about that small detail caught her attention, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Back at the control room, Sarah went through all the material she had collected. The technical report confirmed that the jack was defective, with a crack in the base that could have caused it to fail suddenly. The fingerprints on the tools belonged only to Mike. No signs of struggle or bystanders were found. Everything pointed to an accident, and yet, the next morning she attended the funeral, standing at a distance and watching the mourners. The ceremony was modest, as James had promised. A few dozen people, mostly Mike's co-workers and clients. James and Marie stood side by side, holding hands and accepting condolences. Sarah noticed the way Marie clung to James, as if seeking protection, and the way he hugged her, gently and tenderly. The glances they exchanged occasionally showed not only sorrow, but a deep, almost desperate affection for each other. After the ceremony, Sarah approached them. "Again, my condolences." "Thank you, Detective." James nodded. "Is the investigation finished?" "Almost," she said. "But I'd like to take another look at your house, if you don't mind. Just a formality." James frowned. "Today's not a good day." "I understand," Sarah nodded. "How about tomorrow?" After a brief hesitation, he agreed. "Okay, come in the morning." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Richardson house with a search warrant. James opened the door, looking surprised. "A warrant? Really?" "Just procedure," the detective explained. "To close the case." He reluctantly let her and the forensics team in. Marie was home. She met them in the living room, looking tense but determined. The search went on for hours. The team went through every room, every closet, every shelf. In James and Marie's bedroom, Sarah noticed a bookshelf where something glittered between the books. "What's that?" She pointed at the small object. Marie turned pale but answered calmly, "I have no idea." The detective carefully extracted the object, a tiny camera about the size of a button. She turned to the couple. "You installed a hidden camera in your bedroom?" James stepped forward. We didn't install anything. What is this thing anyway? Sarah scrutinized the device. A miniature camera with a motion sensor. It's often used for covert surveillance. Marie swallowed. I don't understand. Who would install it? Good question. Sarah packed the camera into an evidence bag. Let's see if there's any footage on it. In the living room, one of the CSIs found a flash drive hidden in a desk drawer. Sarah plugged it into her laptop and opened the single file, a video recording. What she saw made her freeze. The footage clearly showed Mike Richardson entering the bedroom where Marie was sleeping. Further footage left no doubt as to the nature of his actions. Sarah looked at Marie, who stood with her hand to her mouth, eyes full of tears. Ms. Foster, the detective said quietly, did you know about this recording? Marie nodded slowly, unable to speak. James put his arm around her, pulling her close to him. It's not what you think, he began. I think your father systematically raped your fiancée, Mr. Richardson, Sarah said stiffly, and she set up a camera to get the evidence and then showed it to you. James was silent, his gaze going blank. And you, the detective continued, decided to take justice into your own hands. You went to the shop and lowered the jack while your father was under the car. No, Marie said firmly, finally finding her voice. That's not true. We found him already dead. It was an accident. Sarah looked at her carefully. Ms. Foster, the tape shows what happened. You were raped while unconscious. That's a felony. You have the right to a defense. I'm telling the truth, Marie repeated, her eyes dry and determined. What Mike did was horrible. I set up the camera to make sure I wasn't going crazy, but his death was an accident. You can speak frankly, Sarah said softly. No one will judge you or James for wanting to defend yourself. We have nothing to hide. James hugged Marie tighter. My father committed a heinous crime, but we didn't kill him. Sarah looked at them for a long moment, then nodded. You will need to give a formal statement to the department. They arrived at the police station an hour later. Sarah personally conducted the interrogation, writing down every word. Marie recounted her diagnosis, her suspicions, the cell. James described how he'd learned the truth, how shocked and angry he'd been. I wanted to talk to him, he said. I wanted to hear him explain it. But when I got to the shop, he was already dead. Under the car, Sarah clarified, with his head crushed. Yes, James replied firmly. An accident. After the questioning, Sarah let them go, but warned them that the investigation was ongoing. When they left, she sat over the case files for a long time, analyzing every detail, every word of their testimony. Technically, she had motive for the murder charge. There was opportunity. There was even circumstantial evidence to suggest that the accident might have been staged, but there was no direct evidence. James's fingerprints were missing from the jack. No one had seen him in the workshop before the body was officially discovered. Forensics confirmed the possibility of equipment failure. And then there was this tape, horrifying evidence that Mike Richardson systematically raped a helpless woman, condemning her to a fatal disease, his own future daughter-in-law. That same evening, Sarah called James and asked for a meeting alone without Marie. They met in a small park on the outskirts of town. James looked tired but calm. What do you want, detective? He asked as they sat down on a bench. Sarah was silent for a long time, staring at the clouds in the sky. I'm wrapping up the investigation, she finally said. The technical analysis confirmed that the jack was defective. Cracked base, metal fatigue. The official cause of death was an accident due to equipment failure. James exhaled slowly but said nothing. You know, the detective continued without looking at him. In 12 years on the force, I've seen a lot of different people, criminals, victims, witnesses. I learned how to tell the truth from the lies. And what do you see now? James asked quietly. Sarah turned to him, a man who protected the one he loved at any cost. Their gazes met, and in that moment, there was a silent understanding between them. What will happen to the tape? James asked after a long pause. What tape? Sarah shrugged. There's no record in the case file. There's just the jack that crashed and the fatal accident. James lowered his head. Why? Because sometimes justice and the law are not the same thing, Sarah replied, standing up. Take care of her, Mr. Richardson, and take care of yourself too. She held out her hand to him, a small flash drive clutched in it. Officially, this physical evidence was lost in transit. Destroy it and forget the whole thing. Thank you, James whispered, accepting the flash drive. You're welcome. Sarah shook her head. I'm just doing my job, establishing the truth, nothing more. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone on the bench. A week later, Mike Richardson's case was officially closed as a workplace accident caused by faulty equipment. A year passed. Sarah Montgomery was walking through a city park, enjoying a rare sunny day. Suddenly, she noticed a familiar couple on one of the benches by the pond. James and Marie Richardson sat holding hands and watching the ducks swimming. They looked calm and happy, despite everything they had been through. Sarah stopped in the distance, not wanting to disturb them. She watched as James kissed Marie gently on the temple, and she leaned against his shoulder with an expression of complete trust and love. Two people bound together not only by a shared happiness, but also by a shared tragedy, a shared secret. The detective smiled to herself and moved on.
All right, so get ready because we're diving deep into a true crime story. And it's a chilling one. We're looking at the death of Mike Richardson. You know from the sources you gave us, well, it looks like a really twisted story. Betrayal, revenge, and what might be a really shocking murder.
It is interesting, right? It all starts so normal. In an ER waiting room. I mean, that's where Mike first meets Marie, his son's fiancée.
Right.
You even flagged that weird compliment Mike gave her in the witness statement. He told her she was really attractive, which is...
Yeah, that's super inappropriate, especially in that situation. Like a huge red flag, knowing what happens later.
Exactly, it's a red flag. And it kind of fits the pattern, you know, for abusers is establishing control and dominance.
Wow, so you're saying that comment was more than just a weird offhand thing. It was like a glimpse into something darker.
Yeah, exactly. And it gets worse when Marie has to move into the Richardson house, even temporarily. Her apartment was being renovated. James was away on business trips a lot, so she's stuck with Mike all the time.
And this is where things get really complicated. Marie has insomnia, right? She's prescribed sleeping pills. And in her testimony, she mentions these strange side effects, like disorientation, gaps in her memory.
Yeah, you highlighted that in her medical records too, right? The fatigue and the memory lapses, that's all consistent with the kind of sleeping medication she was on.
Like, pieces of her nights are just gone. And then it gets even worse. Night sweats, fevers, swollen lymph nodes. I mean, that's serious. She's a doctor herself, so she knows. She gets tested for a bunch of things, including HIV.
And then positive HIV diagnosis. Totally unexpected, especially since she and James tested negative before they started dating. It's a huge shock, obviously. And it brings up a lot of fear and suspicion.
All pointing back to the time she spent at the Richardson house. And you pointed this out in the timeline. Her infection seems to line up exactly with when she's living with Mike while James is away.
Right. It's a disturbing thought. And it leads Marie to take things into her own hands. She buys a hidden camera and puts it in the bedroom. Can you imagine waiting to find out what's been happening during those blackouts?
Oh, the tension. And then she watches the footage.
And what she sees is horrifying. I mean, the recording shows Mike going into her room while she's totally out of it. From the sleeping pills, he abuses her, she's helpless, can't consent.
It's awful. You flagged the transcript of the audio from that camera.
Yeah, it's chilling. It's a reminder of how vulnerable you are under those medications. And of course, the violation she went through. It makes you think about consent and the legal and ethical side of recording someone without them knowing.
Absolutely. And this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
This story is so twisted.
This is where things get even more complicated. Marie shows James the recording. And his reaction, well, it's exactly what you'd expect.
It's just, I mean, his own father betraying him like that. Of course, James is going to be furious, devastated.
Right, you pointed out that diary entry from Marie, the one from that day. She talks about James's anger. It was like he had to make his father pay for what he did.
Yeah.
But then, just like that, it's gone, the anger. And he becomes so calm, eerily calm. He tells Marie, he's got this, don't go to the police, I'll take care of everything.
It's so strange, going from like this rage to being so cold and calculated. I mean, it's fascinating. Psychologically, does that happen a lot?
Yeah, it's actually pretty common. That switch from pure emotion to this, well, almost sinister plan.
You know, you included that article in the sources, the one about the psychology of revenge. It talked about this exact thing, how anger can turn into this cold focus on, well, payback.
Right, like a switch flips, and suddenly it's all about getting justice, or in this case, revenge, on their own terms. It makes you wonder, What was James thinking?
Was he thinking about Marie? Protecting her from more pain? Or was it all about revenge?
It's hard to say for sure, but the sources kind of hint at a mix of things, you know? He was worried about Marie, the impact this would have on her, the stigma. But he's also dealing with his own father betraying him.
So he's walking this tightrope, wanting his father to be held accountable, but also wanting to protect Marie, their future.
And his actions show that. He drives to the workshop where his father's working, and we're left wondering, what's gonna happen?
Marie, she senses it right, that something bad's about to go down. She follows him, trying to stop whatever James is planning. And when she gets to the workshop, well, it's a nightmare.
The workshop is totally silent. There's an overturned car. And under it, Mike's body.
It's just chilling. Was it an accident? Or did James do it?
Detective Sarah Montgomery, she leads the investigation. And you highlighted her initial report. She was skeptical from the start about the accident.
She noticed some things that didn't add up, like the type of jack that was used to lift the car. It was a simple one, not the hydraulic hoist that Mike usually used for bigger jobs.
Yeah, that detail stuck out to me too. And remember that forensic mechanics textbook? It explained that using the wrong jack for a heavy car, well, it makes it way more likely to slip.
So the scene, it was staged to look like an accident. But why would James go through all that trouble?
Maybe to keep Marie from being involved in his father's death, or maybe to protect himself. Because if the truth about his father came out, well, it wouldn't look good for him.
It's just a web of lies, and it's about to get even more tangled.
This is a really tough spot for Marie. I mean, she's dealing with the trauma of the abuse, the HIV diagnosis, and now she doesn't know what's going to happen to James.
No kidding. She's trapped. She wants justice for what Mike did, but what if the truth comes out?
Yeah, and think about her putting that camera in the bedroom. I mean, that shows how strong she is. She wasn't just giving up. She was looking for proof, protecting herself.
Right, and she told James the truth, even though it could have ruined everything.
That took so much courage and trust. She could have kept quiet, but she didn't. She wanted him to know, even if it meant risking their relationship.
It's a turning point for them. They have to face what happened and make some really hard choices.
And James, he sees what his father did. And he makes a choice that changes everything. He covers it up, makes it look like an accident.
I get it. He wanted to protect Marie, keep her from going through more pain.
Yeah.
But it means Mike's actions have no consequences.
Right. It shows this tension in our justice system, you know? We want people to be held accountable. But sometimes there are other things to consider. Like, in this case, the truth could have destroyed Marie's life, even though she was the victim.
It's a tough situation. No easy answers. That's what makes this case so interesting.
Absolutely. And then you've got Detective Montgomery. She finds evidence that points to something criminal. The camera, the footage. She knows it wasn't an accident.
But she closes the case. Officially, it's an accident. You found that journal entry, right? The one she published anonymously, where she talks about her decision, how she struggled with it, you know, between following the law and doing what she thought was right.
Yeah, it probably haunts her, that decision. It shows how justice isn't always black and white. Sometimes it's about understanding the human cost.
In the end, James and Marie, they move on with their lives. But they'll always have that secret.
It's bittersweet. They find some peace, but it's built on lies.
And for Detective Montgomery, this case will always be there, reminding her of the hard choices people have to make. It makes you think about justice and morality. What would you do in those impossible situations?
This whole deep dive into Mike Richardson's death, it raises more questions than it answers. We see the dark side of people, love and loyalty, and how flawed our system can be.
It's a story that stays with you, makes you think. And as we wrap up, here's something to consider. What if you were Detective Montgomery? Same evidence, same impossible choice. What would you have done? And could you live with the consequences?